There's a question in the chat from our audience. Thank you. How does the myth of American exceptionalism play into the formation of American ideologies? And I think that kind of goes along with what we've been talking about. So I wanted to insert that question here.
That's a great question. Yeah, thanks for asking it. You know, one of the most fundamental ideologies at work in U.S. foreign relations is exceptionalism. And it's amazing to see how policymakers and citizens invoke exceptionalism. And so we have a few different chapters that talk also about synonyms. In some cases, civilization, American civilization, is seen as a kind of synonym for exceptionalism. It's this unique derivative of a kind of Anglo-Saxon or Anglosphere kind of civilizational project that only the US can fulfill. So in different eras, you see that. There's a great chapter in the book on civilization in American presidential rhetoric by a scholar named Ben Coates, who's at Wake Forest, who talks about this. You also see exceptionalism playing out in kind of providential millennialism and religious arguments. And so the sort of US mission meets this kind of divinely ordained project of exceptionalism that no other country can embody in this logic. So you see this in, for instance, mission literature, even intended for children. There's a chapter in the book that's really fascinating and worth thinking about as well, on how ideologies are projected generationally to kids. There's another chapter in the book so that's by Emily Conroy Crutz, who's a scholar at Michigan State, but there's a chapter by Daniel Imawar at Northwestern on Star Wars. And so, you know, you can think about mission literatures intended for kids, projecting a kind of exceptionalism, and then a kind of anti-exceptionalism embodied in things like Star Wars, where Lucas was rejecting George Lucas was rejecting both kind of modernization theory, as Americans had developed a kind of vision for how other nations should modernize and push back against socialism and communism through a kind of step series, as Walt Rostow, the theorist, used to put it, to sort of the jump off into modernity. And Lucas rejected that, and actually in the Star Wars series inculcates in kids a kind of vision of the U.S. as the empire, right? What's amazing about this is the U.S. is not, they're not the good guys, they're not the rebels. A lot of Americans probably think that they are at this point, but that's not Lucas's point. And in fact, what Lucas is talking about in that piece that gets back to this exceptionalism kind of myth is that, doesn't the empire think that it's doing right and saving the universe? And what Lucas wants you to note is that the revolutionaries, the poor people on the receiving end of the empire, are the really exceptional ones. It's sort of perpetuating a kind of authentic, force-driven, cosmic, kind of world transcendent set of global, universally transcendent set of ideas. Imawar does a better job than I do in explaining that, so I highly recommend you read that chapter. But back to the core question. The myth of American exceptionalism is embedded in virtually all American ideologies related to foreign relations. It's either in there embedded as a justification of some sort, or outright rejected, right? So in order to, for instance, anti-imperialists to make the argument that the US should not take other territories, it argues the US is not like other empires, should not be like other countries. And then you either see an argument there for exceptionalism, that American democracy requires not ruling people, alien people against their will, to use that terminology, or that American democracy is like other kind of Western burgeoning democracies at the turn of the 20th century, and therefore shouldn't do that thing that monarchies and other kinds of governments have done in the past. So we see exceptionalism at work in the vast majority of ideologies and ideological debates about US foreign relations. It's a really crucial piece of this puzzle. And many scholars have argued this. And I'll add one more piece. Michael Hunt's groundbreaking work on this that we amplify in our project argues that American exceptionalism is very much enmeshed with, as well, racial hierarchies. And so understandings of first, before the social science literatures of the late 19th century, really mid to late 19th century, made arguments for scientific racism. Americans performed their own exceptionalist versions of this. And then in the late 19th century into the 20th century, start adopting kind of a classification of civilizations and hierarchies that is very race-based and is very exceptionalist in that form, that somehow Americans, who and what counts as Americans, were exceptional racially and civilizationally. And that therefore was the grounds for the kinds of expansion around the world and a kind of justification for the divine project that was allowing the US to become first outcompete other rival powers and rising powers in the world system, and then become kind of hegemon after the First World War.